decades-long partnership between Australian live cattle exporters and Indonesian buyers is being put to the test. Continuing high cattle prices and a massive shortage of stock has created what's been called the worst trading conditions in 30 years. As Landline's Kristy reports, it comes at a time when international rival beef producers are eyeing off Asian markets.
In the space of a few hours, 3,000 head of cattle will be loaded here onto 16 cattle trucks, freighted to the Darwin port and off on an export boat to Indonesia.
G'day mate, there you go.
Excellent. You right to roll, Smoothie?
It's a type of logistical wizardry that Kelly White thrives on.
It is, and I actually probably think that's one of the most exciting things about live export is it's really quick.
She runs the yards with husband Don about an hour and a half south of Darwin.
So the cattle come in for 2 clear days before they go on a boat, and basically that's used to feed them, water them, let them get over their trip, make sure they're all in good order, you don't have any sick or lame, put them into their lines and their categories for shipping. So it's a quarantine facility.
The family established an export depot at Bridge Creek Station in 2014, in addition to the cattle properties they already owned and leased.
Over the years, I don't know, in ag, there's just constant ups and downs, you know, like interest rates really high, it will flood, you'll get burnt out, you'll be in a drought, so you're just constantly looking at ways to even it all out.
They are in the rare position of being beef producers as well as running holding yards.
It's probably a really good place to be because, at the moment prices are really high. And that's really hard for exporters to operate in that sort of market. There wouldn't be a lot of profit in it, I dare say. So the volume through the yards is less. But then on the other hand, as producers, we're getting prices I've never seen for our cattle. So yeah, we're very lucky that we can operate in both sort of areas. And then when prices come back or sort of even out, then the volume in the yards will pick up, which makes up for the lack of income from the cattle side of things.
The import arm of the cattle trade is certainly hoping for that shift. Major importer and old hat, Dicky Aduaso, says at the moment it's the toughest climate he's experienced in 30 years he's been in the industry. He's partnered with Australian cattle giant CPC and runs 2 feedlots, one in Jakarta, the other in the northern part of Sumatra.
It started dwindling, the numbers, and then the price of cattle from Australia is quite expensive at the moment. So some of our competitors actually has ceased operation at the moment, but we still are in operation at the moment.
From the heady highs of 2014, when 493,000 cattle were shipped from Darwin, to about half that in 2021, there's certainly been a hefty reduction in trade. To this shipment a few weeks ago, where the cattle were much harder to source and costly. When the pandemic began 2 years ago, there were fears about what it would mean for live exports, with such ironclad borders in place. The trade, however, largely held up, although the toll on the ground was hard.
To tell you the truth, the COVID really hit us very bad in our operation as well in our herds. I mean, our feedlot, we lost about 3 people during COVID. We were one of the operations that really imposed a strict measurement on the COVID situation.
But it's not the pandemic that's prompted worries about the longevity of the trade. The industry is in the middle of a perfect storm. There's a number of factors that have led to this real shortage of cattle in Australia, harking back as far as 2011 with drought and flood really hitting that national herd. The problem is, at the end of the supply chain in Indonesia, there's only so much that importers and consumers are willing to pay. Prices are fetching upwards of $5.50 per kilo for live steers. Record prices never seen before. Importers are also dealing with the soaring cost and growing limits on feed sources.
They are suffering quite heavily right now because there is no trading margin at all in Operation Indonesia. It's more on an operation excellence and operation margin in Indonesia, like a feeding margin. But also the feeding margin has been quite eroded at the moment because of the price of commodity.
For a long time, Indonesian feedlots had access to an abundance of low-cost agricultural products and byproducts like pineapple waste and coffee seed pulp. It's a fattening advantage that Northern Australia doesn't have, and what has made the partnership so mutually beneficial. But in recent times, the price of feed ingredients has gone through the roof due to increased export demand for the same products. Improved processing, which has made many of those former waste products viable for human consumption, and Indonesian government policies geared towards promoting self-sufficiency of food. It's a double whammy, having to pay record prices for livestock and feed. There's certainly no overnight fix. A reduction in cattle prices depends on building up Australia's herd, but that's years away. In the meantime, there's uneasiness about whether there'll be a future trade. The Indonesian government has talked about opening up the door to importing even more frozen Indian buffalo meat. Brazil has also aggressively marked its space in the market.
The government decided to open it, and hopefully another of this crisis will not jeopardize also our mutual beneficial trade.
Brooke Barkler also works in Indonesia when there isn't a pandemic, and is adamant the trade can come out the other side of this stronger. It'll just require some consolidation and improvement in efficiencies.
I think the way that the feedlotters in Indonesia will respond to that is actually just by increasing efficiencies, and whether that be through some more investment into infrastructure and processes and procedures, perhaps adopting some more Western-style feeding methods, so perhaps processing grains.
This will be the focus of a Nuffield scholarship she's hoping to complete when the world returns to normal. In her research, she also wants to explore the socio-economic value of the trade. Last year alone at the feedlot she manages, it imported 70,000 cattle or 84 million meals.
Around the feedlot in South Sumatra, one of our feedlots, there's probably 500,000 people in a 10 to 15 kilometre radius, and all those people are sort of impacted somehow by the feedlot operations. So we have 600 staff. We probably support a family for every 5 cattle that we import, which is pretty amazing. And then we have truck drivers of cattle and commodities, people that supply goods and services to the feedlot, butchers, wet market traders, and the biggest one of all is the commodity supply chain. Just the amount of people that are have employment through that.
Landline was in Indonesia just after the newly minted free trade agreement was signed with Australia in 2020. Under the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, the cattle industry was a major beneficiary, securing duty-free access for 575,000 cattle in year one. Optimism was high, and there was much talk about the rising middle class and the influence protein would have on diet patterns and consumer purchasing. Spending habits are also altering, and it means consumers will spend an additional $1 trillion a year by 2030. Brooke says while competitors might be hovering, consumer patterns remain pretty steadfast, and boxed beef from India or Brazil has its pitfalls. She says wet markets and live cattle still have an intrinsic cultural advantage. With its 260 million strong Muslim population, halal preference requires animals to be processed in their country. Refrigeration is also an issue, with an estimated nearly 50 million Indonesians not having access to power.
And, our long-term relationships have been created over the last 30 years, and I don't think they're going anywhere in a hurry either, and that's a really, important part of our trade. But at the end of the day, live cattle has a competitive advantage over box beef, that we have the product that the consumers actually, prefer, in that it's, produced locally by the local butcher, and it's in line with their culture and traditions.
She says there is undoubtedly increased wealth, with Indonesia tipped to become the world's 4th biggest economy by 2050.
I think we've seen some packaged products, a bit like Coles and Woolworths here, go into supermarkets, into Transmart in Indonesia, but the big growth is in the traditional markets. And I think before we see consumers shift towards shopping in supermarkets, we will probably see more of a modernisation of the traditional markets. So perhaps some better hygiene, some more branding, and maybe some technology and upgrades like refrigeration and maybe the infrastructure of the actual markets themselves.
At Bridge Creek Station, they might not have put all their eggs in one basket, but they're still hoping things return to a more sustainable footing for everyone involved.
Oh, I hope so. This is something that I hope our kids take over. So, that's where I see live export. It's always going to have its issues. It's always going to have its people that don't agree with it. But I think it's our job to make it as robust and as strong industry as we can, and that's things like looking after our animals, looking after our staff, looking after the country, so that it has got longevity.